Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's thesis defense. We are very glad to have everybody out there in the internet watching us, and very excited to see Adam's presentation on his thesis. Today we have Adam Sachs defending his thesis, and I would first of all would like to thank the readers very much, Dr. David Auerbach and Dr. Aurora Lauzardo for taking the time to read this work thoroughly, and we're eager to listen to their opinions and suggestions. We'll start by having a short presentation by Adam, and after he's finished, we'll hand in the floor to the readers so that they can give us the feedback. And afterwards, we'll have a little break. We'll pause the transmission. We will ask you not to leave. Just wait for us until we're done with the deliberation, and we'll then bring Adam back and restart the feed so that you can know the final grade that we'll give the student. So with further ado, let's Adam, go ahead and do your thing.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen here. That working? All right, just going to move the video here. All right. Thank you, Luis, for the introduction. The title of my thesis and presentation is Foodways of the Rarámuri. It is a translation of selections from Ralámuli Nu'tugala Go'ame, or Comida de los Tarahumaras by Albino Mares Trías. Start off by acknowledging some the key players who have gotten me to this point on this project. To those watching this presentation, if you ever have the opportunity to work with the people you see on your screen, either as a prospective student of UPR or on a professional level or in any other capacity, do it. That also goes for the rest of those in the Programa Graduado de Traducción. You are all a tremendous and inspiring group of individuals overseeing this program, and I'm very fortunate to have known you and worked with you. And thank you three and everyone else thank you three so very much for serving on my thesis committee. I would also like to acknowledge Hank Shaw, cookbook author, blogger, podcast host, James Beard Award winner, whose work focuses on wild food, fishing, and hunting. His next book will focus on the cuisine of northern Mexico, and he was gracious enough to not only respond to my inquiry when I was seeking an idea for this project, but to suggest the text that I ultimately chose to translate. Hank, if you are watching now or later, thank you very much. And with that, in this presentation, I will be trying to provide a glimpse into some ingredients, traditions, and history that have quietly influenced the cuisine of Mexico and many others around the world. The source text I translated is an account of these ingredients from the perspective of someone who has lived in their terrain, largely isolated from foreign influence. My goals with this translation are to document a pre-Hispanic people's culinary and ecological knowledge, to expose a Rarámuri narrative to a broader audience, and to provide a better understanding of Native American culinary history by looking more closely at some of its roots. It is my hope that my translation will lay the foundation for further study and wider publication in English of this work. The passages that I selected from this translation, the source text is over 500 pages with 200 unique sections. So I chose the passages based on trying to find a balance between what is the edible biodiversity in what items represent the edible biodiversity in the region from a Rarámuri perspective, and taking into consideration ingredients that have a broader influence, that have spread beyond this region and become part of Mexican cuisine and other cuisines around the world. So start out by giving a little bit of background on who are the Rarámuri. Archaeological evidence has suggested that they have likely inhabited the state of Chihuahua for close to 2,000 years and that they have been subject to foreign influence for the past 400 years. This influence is something that they've resisted from the get-go, and that is what has prompted them to retreat into the rugged terrain of the Sierra Madre Occidental, otherwise known as the Sierra Tarahumara. Translations of their name, Rarámuri, range from nimble feet to light-footed to foot runners. So it's in reference to the endurance that they have in their feet. Give a little bit more context on their location. This map that you see here is a topographical map of the state of Chihuahua in Mexico. It's the largest state in all of Mexico. What you see here in number 1, 2/3 of the state is desert, and then the remaining 1/3 contains more forest than all but one other state in Mexico. Within this forested area, this second map over here, this is the Sierra Madre Occidental, the Sierra Tarahumara. It's nearly 600 miles with altitudes between 4,000 and 8,000 feet. So that very rugged terrain is what has prompted, is part of what has prompted the reliance on foot among this indigenous group, because it's, you know, it's hard enough to even access this area by horse. So travel by foot has become a very important part of their culture and way of life. A little bit more about the Sierra Tarahumara. It has vast biodiversity. At this point, approximately 350 edible plants and 600 medicinal plants have been documented in this section of land. And that biodiversity has major implications, not only for the food that the Rarámuri consume, but also the food that we consume. Some examples that you see here on the bottom here, these are chili piquins, otherwise known as chiltepins. They're little pea-sized peppers, and, you know, we may think, you know, no big deal. Chili peppers out of Mexico, very common. These are the ancestral progenitor of all chili peppers in the world. So any ají dulce that you have in Puerto Rico, or Punjabi chilies that you may try in dishes in India, they all come from this, and this is native to the Sierra Tarahumara. So our food would taste quite a bit different if not for this that grows in that part of the land. Another example here, the Tecomari scarlet runner beans. This is what may have been the person who wrote the commentary at the end of this source text, Dr. Robert Bai, suggested that they may have started the scarlet runner beans may have originally descended from the Tecomari beans that the Rarámuri consume. Some challenges that I encountered in translation start with the title, and focus first on the word comida in the title. In learning Spanish over the years, I have always understood comida to just mean food. But in the nature of translation, in particularly with a text like this, you can't take anything for granted. And in looking a little bit deeper at the definition for comida, within Larouse's online dictionary, which is kind of my gold standard for culinary translation, it defines food as comida as not being just food, but a vehicle for cultural and social engagement, a reflection of values through our ability to nourish ourselves. And so that is what brought me to translate comida not as just food, but as foodways, because it's basically a tangible manifestation of the traditions of the traditions of the Rarámuri, and I argue our own traditions of what we eat. It's the intersection of food with culture. The scholarly journal Food and Foodways defines the term Foodways as something that where we explore the powerful but often subtle ways in which food has shaped and shapes our lives socially, economically, politically, mentally, nutritionally, and morally. And then the next one that I want to devote a little bit of attention to is, you may notice that in the Spanish title, it translates the name of these people as Tarahumara, which is the term that was used by 16th century Jesuit missionaries, likely as a result of misunderstanding or mispronunciation when they heard the Rarámuri pronounce their name or speak their language. Rarámuri is the term that these people use to identify themselves. So since the previous term reflects colonial confusion, I chose to use the term that the indigenous group associates with their own identity. This source text is presented through the lens of a member of their community. So the translation of both the text and the title, to my mind, should reflect their perspective. Next challenge is you may have noticed that that the title of the source text was from the Rarámuri language. It's an indigenous language. What I actually have done here is I translated a translation. What you see here, I refer to as source text A. That's the Rarámuri language, and then below it is the parallel text in Spanish. That is and then my target text was to translate into English. So where this became pretty interesting was when I encountered some clear inconsistencies between my two source texts, if you will. Even me not being able to speak Rarámuri, you can look at this section here, which is about cooking agave. And you see here, I did a manual word count actually of this section in Rarámuri, and it's about 400 words. And in Spanish, it's about 200. So in describing, in this example where it's describing the process of cooking agave, it's clear that there are steps and there are nuances and there are things that I can't help but assume are missing. And so I'm approaching my English text, my English target text, like, how do I reconcile that? How do I square that? To what degree? I mean, and maybe I can't, but knowing that there's already a disconnect by doing a third translation was a challenge that I was facing. And this brings me to the next point, which is I realized very early on that it was important that I provide a glossary as part of my preface to ensure, because what I showed you in the previous slide was an example of a process being described, but much of this book is individual ingredients. Many of these sections are individual ingredients. This is an example of that. It's a type of wild green called, in Spanish, called chinaca, and in English, Mexican thistle. So what a glossary accomplishes is to try to the degree possible, address some of these questions around dealing with a second translation by looking at what is the term that the Rarámuri use? What is the term that is used in Spanish? What is the term that I'm going to use? What's the scientific term? What's a definition for that? And then another thing that the glossary addresses is, you'll see in an upcoming slide, that there are certain terms that even once translated into Spanish, there really isn't, to my mind, a suitable English equivalent. That if you're looking up information about these terms in English, you're still going to be finding, like, to the degree you will find English words, they will be the definition of the word that is used in Spanish. And then another one is that the non-scientific terms, I said, for example, this one is Mexican thistle. That's not the only name for it in English. That's not the only colloquial name. So providing the scientific term is one way of making sure that I'm talking about what is actually, I'm translating into what is actually being talked about in the source text. And it should be noted that I was able to do this because there is an actual identification list at the end of the book that provides the Rarámuri term, the Spanish term, and the scientific term, but not a definition, not an English term, obviously. So I was expanding on that list by providing a more thorough glossary. And my hope is that my glossary serves as a reference tool for future use of this text and further research. So here's an example of my glossary where you see the format where I have one column for the term that I used in my English translation, one column for what, in this case, you see only Rarámuri terms, because this is not something that has a scientific term, but I've got an upcoming slide where I'll show that as well. But we have Rarámuri, Spanish, and then the scientific term, including genus, species, and family, and then a column for the definition. What you see here are various preparations of corn, arguably the most important crop or product that the Rarámuri consume. First, what you have is the esquite, which is corn kernels that get toasted in a pot to break down the moisture and make them pliable, to then be ground on a stone metate into pinole, which is a powder. And that pinole can then get mixed with a little bit of water. And then that paste, that wet paste, then gets mixed with more water to make their energy drink. That paste is called esquiate, make what is an energy drink for them called atole. And what kind of helped me keep all this terminology straight, I'll give, the next slide, I've got a little video to show, about 40 seconds.
El pinole es pues así seco, sí, sí. Y el esquiate pues con agüita. Y eso se muele con agüita en el metate. Sí, desde un principio se muele con agua, echándole agua para que se vaya remojando lo que se va desquebrajando el esquite. Sí. Lo tomamos cuando trabajamos, lo toman los niños. El esquiate nada más nos dura un día. Hay que acabárselo en un solo día.
Right, sorry, just a minute. Okay, and then the next slide talk about something that probably causes more headaches among people who try to speak Spanish and English than anything else. This first one may be a little less, but so talk about citrus. The first one here, toronja. Is toronja pomelo or is it grapefruit? Typically, it's most commonly, just because grapefruit is a fruit that you see more commonly, toronja is used for grapefruit. But when I looked up in my my physical dictionary that I've had since middle school, under toronja, it lists both grapefruit and pomelo, and these are not the same fruit. They are both in the citrus family, but they are not the same. In the back of the book, that identification list that I talked about, it lists this item here, Citrus grandis, which refers to pomelo. Pomelo is the largest citrus known, and it is one of the 5 original types of citrus. Whereas grapefruit that you see here, Citrus paradisi, is actually a cross between a type of sweet orange, Citrus sinensis, and pomelo, Citrus grandis. So again, if you just rely on the colloquial term, it could be very easy to confuse it. But according to the scientific information provided in the back, based on some study, the correct one would be pomelo. The correct translation is pomelo. Then the next one, limon. Depending on where you are, could be lemon or lime, but technically in this case, It's Citrus limonia, which is a hybrid of female citron, Citrus medica, and a male mandarin orange, which is Citrus reticulata. And one name for that is mandarin lime. And then finally, this one, I've been back and forth, especially after reading some commentary from Aurora last night about what to call Lima, which is Citrus aurantifolia, likely a trihybrid intergenetic cross of 3 plant species and at least 2 different genera of citron, Citrus medica, once again, pomelo, and a microcitrus species called Citrus micrantha. It could be called key lime, it could be called Mexican lime, it could be called Mexican key lime. In my translation, I have it as Mexican key lime. I might, based on some of the commentary and what the discussion may be, that's subject to revision. But I'm not going to go too far down a rabbit hole right now and take up too much time. And then this last one here, I think it's also useful to see the full format of the glossary. There's 3 different types of mushrooms that are in the source text, where you have what you have here, as I said, you've got the Rarámuri term here, the Spanish term here, and then the scientific term. In the list at the back of the book, this first one, Caesar's mushroom, was fairly straightforward because it did have the scientific name there, Amanita caesarea. I was able to look that up and determine that the common name for it in English, the colloquial name, is Caesar's mushroom. The other 2 were a little more interesting, both in terms of providing like one challenge that worked out and one challenge that I did my level best with. The text was published in 1982, and then a second edition was published in 2002, and it listed both of these mushrooms in the back as undetermined, what type of mushroom they were. I was able to find a study done in 2014 on the various mushrooms of this region, and they spoke to some of the Rarámuri people there who referred to the repoma mushroom here, which based on that study they determined was Russula brevipes, which is otherwise known as the short-stemmed Russula mushroom. So that's this one here. So I was able to update the text in that sense by determining what the scientific name was and then provide a definition that corresponded to it and the name that corresponded to it. With the last one here, the source text listed it as hongo temporal. I couldn't find any sort of cross-reference for the Rarámuri term. Hongo temporal basically means seasonal mushroom, and the description provided, I'm providing my English translation here, is this mushroom is found where there are dry pines or fallen trees. It always grows there and comes up in May. Some of them grow very large and others are small. They only grow in the mountains and cannot be found in warmer areas. This description and the name seasonal mushroom could describe any number of wild mushrooms. So to me, if I were to translate that as seasonal mushroom, I felt that that was a little bit too vapid. So I chose to call it storm mushroom, which to my mind is slightly more specific because these mushrooms generally are going to fruit when there are heavy rains and when there is moisture. So at least I'm making note of the fact that, not saying, oh yeah, this is any type of mushroom. It's a mushroom that will fruit and sprout under a slightly more specific set of conditions, which is wet conditions. So to conclude, in this context, what are foodways? They represent a sort of balance between the human impact and the environment, and there is an influence of the food in the environment for how we live and how we nourish ourselves. And there's a way that there's a form of identity that's there through food, and in such as that's the case, I felt that that translating this text and exposing it to a wider non-Spanish or non-Rarámuri speaking audience was important because it's documenting living history while it still lives. The most recent estimate, to my understanding of how many the Rarámuri population is around 70,000. So that the population is dwindling, continues to dwindle despite everything that they've done to resist that happening, because the drug cartels are starting to find their way into this land and take advantage of them, and because of climate change. So that's why I for me, that's what makes this significant, and the study of their foodways significant. And with that, I will turn it over to the committee.
Thank you very much, Adam, for your presentation. So now, Aurora and David, it's all yours.
We can fight over this. Aurora, do you want to go first?
Or we can go together.
I have a lot to say, so I don't know. We'll probably, why don't you start, and we may dovetail a lot, so.
Right. Yeah, that's what okay. First of all, Adam, thank you for inviting me to your committee. I'm very proud to be here and very happy to see you finish your degree. And of course, I have a fascination for food and for gastronomy. So this was very appealing to me, this project that you chose. And I want to congratulate you for the amount of work you put in this text. And it's very difficult. And now I'm going to ask you some questions, and I would like to comment with you some of your decisions and some of my observations. But your prologue is a very well documented text. I may sometimes, as I did, I asked you, do you think this is the most reliable source or the more reliable reference? But there is an organization and there is a lot of effort put into this preface, which I think is one of the highlights of your work. Now, I like that you chose Foodways. I found it a very interesting translation for the Comida, and it's food for thought. The idea of Foodways and of using a different terms to talk about the food. But and of course the glossary, you aided yourself with the glossary that the Spanish text had. But you did quite a thorough work, and I like also that your preface is full of references again. So there is a documented process of translating. Saying that, of course, you mention it, and you mention it in your preface, but maybe this is a bigger issue than perhaps you devoted in the preface. But this is a translation of a translation, right? And of course, if I don't know Rarámuri, but you can see that this text is an oral text. It's been written down, but this is an oral account. And you can see it, even though you don't know the language, you can see it in the repetition of certain words, which I will venture to say that they are connectors. They are a word like in Spanish, you use a lot of E, right? Y entonces, y fui a hacer esto, y luego hice lo otro, y fuimos hasta aquí, y estaba, y that sort of adding up elements in discourse, which is different from writing where you do more subordination and you use your subjunctives and you use your commas and you use your phrases, subordinate phrases. So I perceive, and I think that you can see it in the translation too, that this is an oral text. This is a text that comes from orality, right? And somehow it is inserted in the tradition of testimonials in a way, like testimonial literature, because you have somebody who has written language, who has a mainstream, if we want to say, language. And this one narrator, Albino, gives voice to a people that do not have a voice, right? And that kind of literature has its conventions, right? And I think that the orality of the text is something worth considering a little bit more. You say that you're going to approach this totally opposite from domestication because you want to bring the culture and you want to expose this culture, you want to expose a narrative. But sometimes I feel that your text is a little bit more domesticated than I expected. And I missed some of the orality in the text, some of that oral style, which is repetitive, which could be a little bit tedious. And I'm not saying that you have to do it. I am giving you this preamble to ask you, what was your plan when you translated this? Because sometimes I said, well, he has another reader in mind instead of the reader of the Spanish text. He has another reader in mind. So I would like to ask you, how do you compare both your reader and the reader of the first translation of source text B? And how do you compare yourself as the mediator to the other mediator, the one who translated from Rarámuri to Spanish? Because sometimes I felt that your text was a little bit too domesticated. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to tell you a few things and then you can answer. The other thing, and which is again, to stress this point, is that you made a beautiful glossary, right? And I was wondering, if I want to preserve the culture, if I want this to taste more, literally and figuratively, to taste more like the original, the pristine text, the first one, why didn't you keep more terms in Rarámuri or in Spanish? Even in Spanish, it was, you always, most of the time provided the translated term, be it of a food or of a recipe or of a prepared food, and I think that you missed some occasions to stress this culture into your reader. And when I teach translation, gastronomical translation, I always say, well, the only way that you can get them to say tapa, to say tortilla, to say pastel is by saying it. And you have to keep it just so that these foreign words are incorporated into the mainstream language. Okay, so that is I'm saying on this because these are my observations on a text that perhaps was a little bit too domesticated for my taste, but I would like to know why. What's your reader and how does your reader compare to the reader of the text in Spanish? Because we know that the reader of the text in Rarámuri is going to hear it, going to listen to it. It's not going to read it, probably, because this, to me, is an oral tradition. mostly, right? So we have from an oral discourse environment, we go to a written discourse environment in Spanish, which is still a language of the place where this book comes from. And then we have another textual, academic, right? Because I think that maybe the approach of the first translator, the intention was not to make it academic, but just convey and show this to the fellow Mexicans who perhaps don't speak Rarámuri. So so that's it. So please tell me, what was your reader? What reader did you have in mind, and how do you compare yourself to the other narrator?
Yeah, I've been devoting quite a bit of thought to this topic since hearing that, since reading your comments, and Luis mentioned something about to this effect. And 2 days ago, I was in a book club meeting, and something this has come to mind to me today is a translation book club meeting, actually. And someone mentioned that they were listening to a podcast, and at the end of the podcast, the person being interviewed said something to the effect of US English editors have a tendency to focus a lot more on grammar and mechanics than UK English editors, who focus a bit more on how things sound. So I'm kind of thinking to myself that might speak to some of my intuitions to make the text clearer on the page and more readable, and that's how I envision the reader. I also think, like, putting aside this difference between US and UK English, another thought I had is that English has less of an oral tradition, so to some degree, so that there's a way in which I was partial to just smoothing it out and making it more readable. And I was aware of there being a certain orality to the text when I was doing the translation and when I was reading through it. But I think in the midst of focusing a lot on the glossary, I also got focused on just being technically clear in certain ways, where like the repetition could make things more confusing. And to speak to your point about not translating certain things in the glossary, or using the English term in the glossary and on certain items in the glossary, it's another balance that I was trying to be conscious of, is like, if it's too many non-English terms, that can force a lot of back and forth to the glossary, and it can be hard to read the text. So, I mean, kind of the bottom line is I was thinking a lot about what represented readability and fluency to me when I was translating.
Yeah, but there's a way out. You can, because you have two things. You have the titles, and then you have the text, which is something between a description of the product or even an improvised recipe, right? And you could put the word, and that's the way that these terms start to settle in the dominant culture. Let's say it as it is. I mean, regardless of the differences between English, American, or UK English, or editorial preferences, the truth is that you are inserting this text in a dominant language, right? And so you could very well keep the words in the titles, for instance, keep more words in the original, in the Spanish, or even in the Rarámuri, and put the translation in parentheses. And people start, I mean, I always say that translation is a political act, and you educate your readers, and you have to be a compassionate teacher. So you cannot expect them to learn the glossary and then start reading.
Mhm.
But if you envision your teaching, right, as using the term and then in parentheses for the titles, at least, you could have kept more words like the chiles and all these
Mhm.
other food terms, and just put them in parentheses. That is a very healthy step towards foreignization and towards bringing this culture into a dominant culture and language. So in that sense, you could have kept the word and used parentheses. And besides, through repetition, because this text is very repetitive, through repetition, your reader learns. That is the basic discourse strategy of orality. You have to repeat, right? So in that sense, you could, I'm not saying that you have to do this now, but if you pursue finishing this text, and if you see that in your text, you're going to have the glossary, then let your reader make an effort. Don't chew, no se lo des masticado, right? As we say, it's a very appropriate metaphor here. Just let them do the chewing, and they have a glossary. And so I think that is maybe my biggest concern with your approach, that I think that it is quite domesticating in that sense. Okay. And that's pretty much. Do you want to answer to what I said or anything? Or
I mean, I don't have that much to add. I think it's a valid and helpful observation. And honestly, I really appreciate how you, I mean, you framed it in a way that I wasn't really, I wasn't quite connecting a couple of the dots of, and I think, you know, it's interesting. I do the translation, and then I do the preface, and I did a whole lot of research on the preface. And if I had revisited my translation in greater depth than I would have had, because once doing the preface, I did some of the research, kind of spoke to a lot of underlying issues related to the oral tradition among this group of people. And, you know, then if I were to really do a deep dive and revise the translation, I might have a different approach at that point.
I'm sure that you would have. I'm sure. And then you wanted how many words did you want it to translate?
Well, I mean,
this is very difficult.
Yeah, I had 12. The limit is 10 to 12,000 words. I think the source text that I sent you, the number of scanned images, it was like 194, and the book is 500 pages. So, I mean, we're somewhere under half the space of that book.
No, but I was just kidding, because
there's so many interesting ingredients that I just, you know, I didn't have space for them.
No, but I mean, revisiting what you said you were going to do in the preface and see what happened in the translation. And I was just kidding, because, you know, with 12,000 pages, it's a lot of, 12,000 words is a lot of work. Imagine with more.
But exactly. Precisely.
Okay, so that's for me about the preface. This is what I wanted to bring, and then when we Right, David, you want to do this? You want to talk about the preface and then we go over the translation?
No, I would like to say something actually, which is why I will lower my hand now.
Oh,
No, what I would like to say is that Adam, first of all, congratulations. I didn't say that. So, but congratulations on an extremely thorough work. But I think that you really do need to discuss your translational approach and your translational perspective in your preface. You don't. And the thing is that suddenly we're in the translation, and the first thing that kind of, discussing this idea of domestication, the first thing that I ran across that kind of really sort of shocked me was to see mom and dad. So, just to think about, those are such American sounding words. And there they are in the midst of this Rarámuri, environment. It just seemed very awkward to me. And then, I won't go into the translation itself yet because we're not discussing that, but I think that you really do need to, you have a strategy, obviously, and you have something in mind. I think you have a publication in mind, and I'd like to know what kind of publication that is. You do have a publication in mind. You go to book clubs, you have a publication in mind. I think you want to publish this, but who is the audience? And that's what we need to know. And I think that you really need to discuss that strategy. And if you're going to use, terms like decolonial, they have to be justified as well. How is this decolonial? I don't see that. I see this as actually an incursion, or it's a transformation, at least, of the source text. So that's my suggestion, that you do, and it doesn't have to be like 20 pages worth of explanation, but it has to be, I need to know what kind of thing you are creating here.
Okay.
So that's my suggestion. One point on the preface. Are we going to continue to talk about the preface a little bit, or
as you wish, you can talk.
One thing, and that's, I think, a very, very important point, in terms of the content. But one thing that I felt that was really missing, which led to so many other questions, and I think that there are a lot of things that need to be more neatly tied together, is that there's no mention of a style guide. What style guide were you using?
Okay. I was using the Chicago. I was advised that it did not need to be in there, but I'm glad you asked this question, because I did put a lot of thought into this. So I used Chicago Manual of Style. The reasons being because Chicago Manual of Style, I considered Chicago APA or MLA, and Chicago really was the only one that had some explicit guidelines for the use of a glossary, for the use of endnotes, and for the use of footnotes. And I used all three in my preface, or in this document, because I felt that to me, it seemed cleanest to have footnotes for the preface, endnotes for the glossary, and as I said, I needed a glossary in there. So I was using Chicago Manual of Style for like how I was going to come up with all that.
Okay, I kind of figured, just on the basis of the block paragraphs, the block quote style, because it's the only one that does single spacing of block quotes. But then, if that's the case, first of all, you really need to include it in your bibliography. because, you know, I'm not sure, I don't know if anybody else is sure. And then the thing is, if you go to the bibliography and you go to the notes, you'll see that actually a lot of it doesn't follow Chicago Manual of Style.
Oh, that's frustrating.
So you're going to have to go over that again. There are a lot, and I made notes, you know, I made notes on actually, you know, I'll send you everything. I don't have to go into all the details here, but that was something that I thought was missing. And then I will just make, there are a couple of things, you know, that I'm a stickler about, paragraph style, for example. There's no extra space. If you're gonna, between paragraphs, if you're going to use indented paragraphs, which of course you're going to use, there's no extra space between paragraphs, but there is in your text. So you'd want to get rid of that extra space. And then, you know, it's kind of a word default that you have to be aware of. So, you know, just no extra space between paragraphs. And then I have this other thing about how the first paragraph of any given section or chapter or the very beginning should not be indented, because we know it's the first paragraph, and it kind of looks weird to me, and there's nothing published in the English-speaking world nowadays that has an indented first paragraph. So, but I'm looking at it from the vantage point of an editor. So I'm looking at this as a professional work, and all of these comments that I'm going to make, you know, there are a few other points for the preface to acknowledgements has no E after the G in US English as the standard spelling. It's like judgment. Judgment, J-U-D-G-M-E-N-T. And that's standard, that's Merriam-Webster, you know, it's the same thing for acknowledgements. And I'll just mention a couple of other things, and then we can go into the translation. You discuss at a certain point how the narrator has a deceptively simple voice. What do you mean by deceptively?
First of all, one thing that I'm coming back to Aurora's commentary, one note that I just made is how that I think is very helpful is I was thinking about voice from the standpoint of just how does it sound? What is the tone? What is kind of like, you know, what's the author sound like when he's writing? And I think a point that Aurora makes well is that she's looking at this from voice of the people. And though I do like make reference to that, I wasn't specifically thinking of that in terms of narrator's voice. With that said, what I meant by that is in regards to just the style of writing, the style of speaking seemed very straightforward and it seemed very simple. But then once I would dig into one or two terms in a sentence, it would require quite a bit of research to figure out what something was or what he was talking about or what so that's the deceptive part.
Okay, yeah, but maybe you could use a different adjective because I'm just a little bit uncomfortable with the word deceptive being applied to the narrator. Maybe even seemingly, it's kind of a minor point. You provide a translation of an excerpt from the source text prologue, but we never get to see the source text prologue in the actual text, and it's kind of difficult for us to assess your translation of that excerpt without that actual text, which brings to mind also this since you use the word curating at a certain point, There's no mention really, there's not much mention made of Don Burgess and his own, academic methodologies. I think that something more could be said about him and his role in disseminating texts of this nature.
Okay.
As I said, there are a couple of other minor points, but another thing that struck me, and actually I've been to this region, I've been through the Barranca del Cobre many years ago, many years ago in the 1970s, and when I was almost prenatal. But one thing that you don't really stress very much, and just having been in Mexico myself again, is that, there's almost nothing in here that's strictly speaking autochthonous to the Rarámuri. There's almost nothing. It's almost all, like almost everything that you find in here, all of the terminology and even the plants and the food items and everything, almost all of it is kind of, trans-Mexican. And I think that, that's an interesting point. I mean, you talk about a culture, well, not really acculturation, but you talk about, the incursion of the colonial Spanish and Mexican culture, and how the Rarámuri have been forced to retreat into the recesses of the Sierra Tarahumara. But at the same time, you don't really talk that much about how acculturated they've become, and what I'd like to know if in your presentation, in your preface, exactly what is it that's specifically Rarámuri about the rest of the text? Because almost everything is kind of, as I said, trans-Mexican. So those are a couple of other points. I don't want to waste too much time. But I'll tell you something. There's something that I have as kind of a pet peeve, and it's a while as a single word. I wish you would split it up. A while, and if only because as one word, it can only be used in certain circumstances. It can never be used with a preposition, for example. And for some people, it can come across as bad style. So reconsider it, as something to think. It's a tiny little thing, but then here's something more important. Uppercase indigenous.
Okay.
Please, even the New York Times does. If you're going to say that you're being decolonial and you're not going to refer to them as indigenous with a capital I, doesn't come across really. And also Nahuatl should be, it's inconsistent. Sometimes you have it uppercase, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you even have Nahuatl italicized. It shouldn't be italicized. It's a language. We don't italicize Latin or Romansh or Serbian or anything else. So, okay. And I think that is it for my, but as I said, I provided ample notes and there's more. So if you want to, Aurora, if you want to head into the translation itself, did you want to discuss that? You're muted.
Yeah.
I'm going to mute myself.
Thank you. Yes, for the most part, I think I sent Adam my observations on the translation very thoroughly. I know I am very thorough in these things, but I don't bring them I don't bring everything to this discussion because it doesn't make much sense. But I do, and this of course has to do again with your plan. And I do have to mention that there are some Spanish words that get mixed up in the translation, like barranca, or barranca, que algo sale o que uno anda borracho. These are Spanish expressions that and Mexican expressions that some of them might need a little bit of revision. Something that I find very interesting about the Mexican Spanish, and Puerto Ricans do it too, is the use of diminutives. And of course, most of that is lost in the translation. And I would never want you to see the little this, the little that, the small this, the small that, because it would be so tedious that people would simply discard the book, and something very important will be missed. But I did observe that agarrar la pura espiga, the Mexican Spanish has some words that you might want to revise. And I love the barbecho, the barbecho soil, but sometimes, and I think I told you, if this is the little part of criticism, so just fasten your seatbelt, it's okay. But there are instances where you translate barranca in a way or in another one, or barbecho as arado and not árido, and these are it's the tricky part of the language, right? And it
I was taking a second look at like a number of these that you're bringing up. I was taking a second look, both, I mean, largely this morning. I kind of read through everything last night. This morning, like, what's interesting, the example that you just said, like they put the word arar in parentheses, and some of these parentheses create confusion of what the word is in the source text. And I think barrancas is another interesting one where, like looking at that further, I actually had in my notes that I was almost going to bring up in the presentation that barrancas really is a technical term for the geological formations in that region of Mexico. So that's really the term that I should be using, not, and I was almost landing on canyons because another name for there is the Copper Canyons, but
but even the valley ones, and it's not a valley.
I when we're on Barranca, my question is, because, and once again, I have been through this area. I've been on the train that goes through this. It's a very, very long ride. And you get to, you stop along the way, and it's all Rarámuri territory. But when you're talking about the barranca, for me, that's really it's the canyon. It's the canyon, and it has to be, because the thing is that anything that is above the canyon is going to be more arid, and it's going to be drier. And as you go into the canyon, it becomes far lusher. So, and it's wetter and lusher. And so every time, and you gave this translation that I did not really understand at all on the range. The range is a farm. The range is flat land. And this barranca, I don't know where that comes from. I didn't understand that translation at all. So I think that, for this, I think that geologically and in terms of terrain, we have to understand that if this guy's talking about La Barranca, he's talking about that very obvious feature. It's massive, it's huge, it's bigger than the Grand Canyon. So I think that has to really, that's part of it that has to change. But that was one point, and the arido, arado, there are few things like that. And I'm not going to say much more about the translation either, because I do have notes.
Yeah.
But you really upped the register for, in general, we talked about this, I think you up the register from the source text or the secondary source text into English by using a lot of terminology that is never used in the source text, like dehydrate, and there are a whole bunch of terms that they're just not source text. And there was one last thing that I wanted to say, and then I'm stopping with that. There's some other mistranslations, like bandeja gets read as bandera for some reason. And also at a certain point in the text, you change Rarámuri to Rarámuri.
Oh dear. That's just a
and it
typo.
goes through through this whole section of the text. Suddenly it has an accent on the end, on the I.
Yeah, that's just a typo.
Okay. And then there's this term canoa that's used.
I marked it, yeah.
That's used for threshing agave, and you use boat. And it's a trough. I would use trough or even an oblong receptacle, but it's a trough. So in any event, that's all I wanted to say about the translation for now.
Yeah.
And wait, one last thing. Sorry, is a glossary. The glossary is very extensive, and I wish I knew that there was a glossary also in the source text. That would have been, we're not given the whole thing. We're not given the prologue. We're not given the glossary. I would have liked to see that.
I did include the lista de identificación. I didn't send the lista de identificación in my scans. Oh dear, I'm terribly sorry about that.
No, but maybe it is there.
Sí, en la lista de identificación
Yeah.
está. Sí está, David, sí está al final.
Yeah, I could have sworn I made a point.
All right, yes. Okay,
I know I didn't include the prologue. That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, no, that's true. Okay, you're right. Right. And sorry. But one thing I don't know if it's necessary, because your text is really long. Your preface is really long, and the glossary is very long. Is it really necessary to explain to readers what a tomato is?
I think it was, so I would need to look back at what specifically I said in the definition, but what was interesting to me is I didn't realize that tomatoes originated from this part of the world.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, and the Nahuatl word, tomato, that's also very interesting. That's interesting, but I don't think that we need to have a physical description of what a tomato is. And the thing is that the glossary, now that I did look at it originally, but the lista de identificaciones, that is very simple. It just gives the word. I think that there's a little bit too much verbiage and too much. It's almost as if you're babying the reader. If you have to explain something like that.
Okay.
That's it. Okay, and I'm finished now.
Okay. Well, I think that I am sure I agree with David in the extension of the preface. I think you fell in love with scientific terms and all this naming. It gives the impression. And again, I would have, and I think David and I agree both in this, maybe we would have liked to see more than all this explanation of the plans, which at the end of the day, We can look them up in the glossary, and we can look them up in the rich number of references, which are also a click away. I mean, in that sense, you help the reader a lot. I mean, and that is a major accomplishment of your work. Okay, all those references, all those links in your text, they really help the reader. Okay, so that is excellent what you did there. But in what you tell your reader, I think that I would have preferred to see more, as David says, more of your plan as a translator, a little bit more about what you're doing with this. You're like in the middle of two cultures. You're between the Rarámuri and the Spanish, and then here you're bringing the English. So there you are shuffling all these cultures and languages and ways of naming things. And in that sense, and you don't have to do it now, okay? Your thesis is done, all right? And I insist on this because your thesis is done. But if you plan on publishing this or making something more of this than just the requisite for your master's translation, consider these things. These will be some very interesting topics to read before reading your translation. And again, if you explain your plan, if you explain your approach as literary, if there is a mediator between cultures, this is an example of a mediator between cultures. If you explain that, you are doing your teaching part of our job, and you're doing our political part of our job. Okay, so maybe if you, for the future, if you consider publishing this and publishing it, of course, you will need to publish a translator's preface. Consider that it suffices with the glossary and the excellent job that you did with the links. It suffices. Don't dwell on that, because that is like the obvious. Okay. Go into what your reader doesn't know about what you did, because at the end of the day, I can look up what you explained, but show your reader what you did, what means in terms of process, in terms of political positioning, what you did. Okay, I find, as a reader of a translation, I find that a lot more interesting, because the other information is just information that can be found a click away. Okay, but after this, the difficult part of the defense, I would like to repeat that you did you did a lot of work here. You put a lot of effort. It shows. And a word of advice for you and for all the students that are watching us. There comes a time when you have to forget about the source text and just read the text, because I was talking with Luis about this. There's something about the reasoning that the discourse naturally guides you through a reasoning. And maybe you don't understand this sentence, but you will understand this as you read the following sentence and the following sentence. So maybe, as you said, maybe you needed to read it just by itself and just see how it reads. I don't know if you were able to do this enough. It's not only one reading sometimes. And I think that's very important, because the text has a logic and it talks to you. But you cannot be comparing two documents to hear the logic of the text, because then you're just making sure that you translated every word, but the logic, the fluidity of the logic of the text, you can only perceive when you read it by itself. Okay, and then it will force you to go back if you stumble or if something doesn't make sense. But I think that this is a very difficult job you embarked on. This is very, very difficult, and I commend you for that. And I am very, very honored that you let me participate in your defense.
The honor's mutual.
I'm done. Dr. Auerbach, do you have anything else to add? Because I am.
You're on mute, David.
No, yeah, I think that whole issue of process is a very important one. And one thing I wanted to say too, just reflecting on the fact that so much of this is, as I said, trans-Mexican, of the, cultural accoutrements, aspects, whatever. I wonder whether that in itself might have something to do with the translation too. Because we can't know that. It may be that, there's just, okay, the people who translated are going to give like, okay, well, here's this thing that we have in the rest of Mexico. We're going to translate it as that.
Okay.
It's impossible to know, those bits of minutia without really having access to the source language,
Yep.
Rarámuri. So it's a really interesting, anthropologically it's very interesting, linguistically it's very interesting, those aspects, and it's something that you could consider as well, as Aurora said, if you want to publish this and you're so close to finishing the entire text that you might as well. So anyway, that's all I have to say, and I want to thank you again. It was really fascinating, and I feel very sad for the Rarámuri because incursion for so long, and I don't know, they're hanging on by a wire there, but anyway.
I had no idea that you had actually been to that region and you were familiar with them. Makes me that much glad that I asked you to be on my committee.
I'm not on a first name basis with
I know, but still.
But no. I've always been fascinated by that area, and it's really, it's quite something. And if you have a chance now, I would say go while you can, and step very lightly, very, very lightly, but go. That train trip is among the most astonishing things that you'll ever do in your life. So, okay, anyway, that's me and that's it. And I'm over and out, and I'm muting myself.
Thank you very much, David and Aurora, for all of your feedback and thoroughness of your observations. We are now going to take a little break. Please, if you're watching, don't go. Wait for us. We'll be back. I'm going to stop the
Right after this, okay?
Okay.
We're back live. Watching, don't go. Wait for us. We'll be back. Hold on. Why are we? Okay. I think we're. Let me check. Hold on, because I'm not sure. Yeah, it seems like we're on. Thank you for waiting and for still being here. Adam, we've just talked a bit about your work, and the committee has decided to give you a grade of notable. So we congratulate you. Felicidades.
Felicidades.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
So if there's anything you want to say, we're going to just cut the transmission, or
Nope. Thank you all so very much.
all right. So thank you everybody for being here, and we'll see you on the next Defensa de tesis. Have a good evening and a great week.